Thanks, Mom. For those of you who I've not met, I'm Duke Blackwood, and I'm the director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the Reagan Forum, tonight made possible by the Charles and Ann Johnson Foundation. Before I introduce our special guests, I ask that you please turn off those cell phones and pagers so we can keep a quiet audience. I must tell you that we are truly blessed here at the library. We have the honor to continue serving President Reagan. We have a spectacular facility, and we produce important events like this evening. However, I must say, one of the true special blessings is working with someone who served or stood by Ronald Reagan for more than 50 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the former First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Ronald Reagan, escorted by Governor Huckabee. I ask that you please remain standing while the governor comes up to the stage. And in honor of the men and women who serve our country, both here and abroad, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Here at the Reagan Library, we are proud and honored to have such broad support. I'd like to take just a few moments to recognize those individuals who helped make this such a wonderful place. First, please join me in thanking all of our local city officials from Moore Park, Thousand Oaks, and Simi Valley. And from the county, Supervisor Peter Foy. Peter. Now, I'm sure Governor Huckabee would agree that we should give a special thank you to all of our volunteers and docents. Let's give them a big round of applause. And finally, to all of you who provide the financial support for the library and the foundation, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. In preparing my remarks for this evening, I spent some time with Governor Huckabee's book, Do the Right Thing. In his book, he writes, quote, "American values are alive and well by sticking to principles, finding passionate and dedicated followers and helpers, and by connecting with the real spirit of America, we can return this country to greatness." This passage caused me to pause and reflect upon the man whose name adorns the library walls. It has been 20 years since President Reagan left the Oval Office, but his timeless principles are just as important today as they were back then, particularly with the challenges that we face today. This spirit of America that Governor Huckabee speaks about is at the heart of our national pride. And in 1984, President Reagan remarked, My friends, we are so lucky. We've been granted the right to stand for something. So much of our greatness is behind us, but so much of our greatness is still before us, out there waiting for us just to take advantage. It is, in truth, a wonderful time to be alive. And we're so lucky because as a people, we still have the opportunity to be patriots. And as a nation, we still stand for something. Like Ronald Reagan, Mike Huckabee believes in the American people and in their ability to change this record to this nation for the better. And like Ronald Reagan, Mike Huckabee believes that people can and should work together, whether they are Republican or Democrat, to accomplish what is right for our country. As Ronald Reagan so deftly proved, it all starts with dialogue. In his new initiative, the Vertical Politics Institute, which was created to work together with citizens to help find solutions to the many challenges our nation faces, Governor Huckabee says, quote, "Ultimately, people don't care whether an issue comes from the left or from the right. What they want to talk about are the ideas that lift America up and make us better." So let's begin that dialogue now with Governor Huckabee. He is a leader, a New York Times best-selling author, a marathoner, a television and radio talk show host. Okay. Sorry, Mom. A pastor, an avid musician, and a serious presidential contender, just to name a few. And this is his 5th visit, and so therefore we call him a friend. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce a man who Time magazine honored as one of the best 5 governors in America. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Huckabee.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You really worried me when you stood. I'm used to audiences doing that when I'm introduced, but it's normally because they're headed for the exits. I want to begin by expressing my deep and sincere appreciation to a person who I believe has lifted the role and the stature of the First Lady of the United States to a new level through the gracious way in which she served our nation and our world. The remarkable gifts that Nancy Reagan gave to all of us as our First Lady made it so that we truly could call her not just the First Lady, but the First Lady, with an emphasis on lady, for she epitomizes and truly personifies everything that I think all of us would hold dear in that gracious title, and an honor and a privilege to be here with you tonight, Mrs. Reagan. Thank you so very much for being a part of this evening. I want to begin by expressing appreciation to all of you for coming. I don't know who you thought was on the program tonight, but obviously it must have been someone else. I'm told that all the seats are sold out, and that is a very, very good thing. And I spoke at the First Baptist Church of Dallas a few years ago for a special service they were having. And the church has 2 services, one at 8 o'clock, and then they have another one like at 10:30 in the morning. When the pastor was escorting me into the auditorium for the early service, he says, now Governor, I want to warn you, because this is so early in the morning, it's somewhat empty when we start, but it's pretty full by the time we end. I said, Mac, that's quite comforting. I'm used to it being the other way around. It's pretty full when we start, and it's pretty near empty by the time we get finished. I just hope that you all stay for the entire moment. I also want to say I'd like to invite all of you to dinner with me right after the event. I'd like to do that. I'm not doing it, by the way. I just would like to. You know, people have come up to me since the campaign last year ended, And everywhere I've gone in this country, and that's pretty much everywhere because I'm on an airplane 4 or 5 days a week, traveling all the time, speaking, and then being in New York every week to host the weekend show on the Fox News channel. And the travels have been fascinating, interesting, and somewhat encouraging for this reason. Wherever I've gone, I have people come up to me and they say, I just want you to know, I voted for you. And that is comforting, especially when you've lost an election, you know. And what makes it especially nice is when they will come up and say, not only did I vote for you, but my wife did too. And this meant a lot to me over the first few months after that disappointing primary in which I had to exit the stage sooner than I had intended. Until about 2 months into this experience of hearing all this, I realized that more people had come up to me in airports and claimed to have voted for me than actually voted for me in all the states combined across America. You know what's really ironic, if not painful? More people seem to know me from hosting a television show on Fox News than ever knew that I ran for president. I'm not kidding. I was one of those candidates that started from such a point of obscurity, and we started out with no money, didn't have a whole lot more by the time it ended. And in the early days, it was so very challenging because I was faced that uphill challenge that we faced because of the lack of name recognition and money. And I remember early in the campaign, my press secretary and I had gone to Denver. We were supposed to do a fundraiser about 45 minutes from Denver. So we landed, went to the car rental counter. We were going to get a car, drive out to the event. And so as the press secretary went up to the counter, she presented the campaign credit card to the clerk behind the counter, who looked at it. And on the card, it said, Huckabee for president. It's a true story. A young lady looked at the card, looked at her and said, Huckabee for president. President of what? Let me tell you, that really hurts when you're running for president of the United States. At that point, you don't even want to say what it is. And it was that kind of experience early on. Now, by the time the campaign had come to an unfortunate conclusion, then people seemed to start recognizing who I was, but then it was too late. And then I would have the experience of walking in some public place and a person coming up to me with that look of, they thought they knew me, but they couldn't quite remember why. The political junkies, of course, always knew. But there was a certain level in the public who didn't keep up with politics very much, and they looked at me with that view. They couldn't remember if I ran for president or sold them a used car last year. They just knew that they knew me from somewhere. And occasionally the experiences have been awkward, if not painful. This happened to me about a month ago in the Delta Crown Room in Atlanta. And I'm in and out of there all the time, and I know the employees now by first name, and often and when I come through, they want to have me sign something for a niece or a nephew. And I was doing that. A couple of them were asking me, could they take a picture? And we were doing that. And there was a young lady watching all of this transpire. And I know what was happening. She looked up there, saw this, and said, that guy looks familiar. I don't know what he did or what he does, but these people seem to want to have a picture with him and have him sign something. So she walks over. Now look, this is not one of those political stories. I'm going to tell you, this is exactly what happened. She walks up and she says, excuse me, but I think I know you. Aren't you Bob Dole? I love Senator Dole, my friends, but I'm young enough to be his son, not his double. I was in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, and Senator Elizabeth Dole was there introducing me at an event. I got to tell that story. She thought it was funny, but the only person who thought it was even funnier than Mrs. Dole and you was my wife, who really, really thought it was funny. In a little while, I'm going to have an opportunity to answer the questions that you have, and I look forward to doing that. We call that in politics Q&A. I know you think that stands for questions and answers, but it actually stands for questions and avoidance. That means you ask anything you want. I just try to not say something that will forever come back to haunt me. We're certainly living in one of the more interesting times of our nation's history, thanks to the last few months. America elected an individual who promised hope and change. And there has been a lot of change. I'm not sure about the hope. I'm concerned very strongly, and not about his political affiliations, but in all candor, I am very concerned about the fundamental changes that the country is making in terms of the intrusion of the government in private enterprise, the reversal of our foreign policy positions, our willingness to have unconditional conversations with tyrants and despots, the thought that we in many ways are apologizing for America's strength rather than being grateful to God and to the men and women of our military who have given us that strength. I'm equally concerned about the fact that we have come to believe that it's the government's responsibility to make winners and losers in the private marketplace and no longer allow capitalism to do what it always has done, and that is to select by its own devices those who have been faithful and frugal and true to the basic principles of good business and good operations, and those who haven't, and to allow the innovations and the ideas that create enterprise to flourish. I'm concerned that we're moving into realms where we've never been before, where the President of the United States is actually hiring and firing CEOs of private companies. And I wonder how many Americans really thought when they voted last November that this was the change that they were voting for. I'm reminded of the school that was having their annual Christmas gathering, and it was typical at the school that the children would all bring the teacher a gift at Christmas time. We did that at my school growing up. You may have done that at your school. Now, the teacher knew all of the children in the classroom, knew what their fathers did, and it was typical that the children would usually bring something that their parents had an obvious connection to. Came time for the teacher to receive the gifts, and first little girl that was to bring the gift up to the teacher's desk, her father owned a bakery. So as the little girl was walking up, the teacher said, "Oh, sweetheart, I bet I know what you've done. I bet you brought some nice baked goods from your dad's bakery." Little girl's eyes got real big. She says, "That's exactly what I brought." And she smiled broadly. Teacher received the gift. A little boy whose father owned a pharmacy, he was walking up, and the teacher said, "I bet you brought some of those nice fragrances from your dad's pharmacy." His eyes got big and he smiled. He says, "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I brought." The next little girl was walking up, and the teacher knew that her dad had the liquor store there in town. And as she was walking up, the teacher said, "I bet you brought me some of that nice wine that your dad sells at his store." Little girl's face looked confused, and she says, "Well, no, ma'am." As she handed the package, the teacher noticed that it was moist under the bottom of the package. She tasted and thought, "Oh, I think you must have brought some of the brandy from your dad's store." "No, ma'am." She tasted again. "Well, this may be some of that scotch that your dad has at his store." Obviously, the teacher was well familiar with all the products on the shelf. And finally, the little girl looked up and says, "No, ma'am, it's none of those things. I brought you a puppy." And I wonder how many Americans thought we were getting one thing, and in fact, we have gotten something very, very different indeed. You have to wonder who in the world thinks that if we have an economic crisis because we have spent money we didn't have and borrowed money we don't have the capacity to pay back, how we're going to fix our economic woes by spending even more money that we don't have and borrowing yet even more money than we can ever pay back or that our kids or grandkids could ever pay back. It's the equivalent of sending your child off to college in his freshman year, giving him a check to cover the entire first semester of tuition, room, board, books, and spending money, and saying, "Now, son, here's the money that's got to last you through the semester. Be very careful with it, and we know how much it costs to go to school the first semester." But we do realize that things happen and there could be an emergency beyond the amount of money in the check. So in this sealed envelope, there is a credit card, but this credit card is only to be used in the most extreme of emergencies. A week later, the son calls and says, "Dad, I've spent all the money in the check and the credit card is maxed out. What should I do?" How many fathers would say, "Son, don't worry, I'll send you another check and send you 5 more credit cards"? There's not a parent in this room who would think that's the way to solve the problem of a son who spent all the money in the first 2 weeks of college. And yet, under the current direction that our government seems to be going, you would think that the way that we can dig ourselves out of an economic hole is to stand in the hole and to continue to dig and invite more shovels so that we can dig deeper. It makes no sense whatsoever. And one thing I am convinced of as I stand here at this podium in this magnificent facility, that President Ronald Reagan knew better, led better, and that's why we had a much better situation economically after a few years of Ronald Reagan's policies than we have after a few months of Barack Obama's policies in the White House. Now, some of you may remember that one of the, well, in fact, 2 debates for the Republican primary were held here at the Reagan Library. The first primary debate and the last one. The first one was broadcast on MSNBC, and the last one broadcast by CNN. I have some very vivid memories of both of them, not for what I was able to say, but for what I never got to say, because the networks were pretty careful about picking out who they thought were going to be the front runners based on how much money the candidates had rather than the ideas the candidates had. And it was especially frustrating in that final debate that we were here and Anderson Cooper was hosting it. You may remember that 2 of the candidates were at one end of the table and the other 2 of us were at the other end of the table, and we might as well have gotten up, gone, got a sandwich and come back at the end of it and congratulated the other 2 for a nice argument, because we were pretty much ignored, to the point that at one moment I finally turned to Anderson Cooper and I said, "Anderson, I don't know if you know this or not, but we're also running for president and we would love to get a question or 2 if you don't mind." One of the things that I want to point out that you may not be aware of, there were 11 debates among the Republican candidates for president in the course of 2007 and then early 2008, 11. Guess how many questions we had on education? You're right, whoever said none is correct. 0. Not one question. We had 1 question on health care in the entire 11 debate series, and Tommy Thompson was asked that question. Most of the time, we would be asked the same questions over and over again and spend so much of the time, often about Iraq. And frankly, other than Ron Paul, there was not a dime's worth of difference between the rest of us. It would have been very easy to say, okay, would one of you give the official answer for 10 of the 11 or 12 of the candidates, and then we'll give Ron Paul 30 seconds to give the opposing view. And we would have been done with that and could have moved on. So one of the things I wanted to do tonight was to talk with you more specifically about some of the areas that we need to be addressing in this country that are foundational to a strong American future. I won't cover everything because there's not time. I've got the time, but you don't have that much patience. Let me talk for a moment of something that is getting very little attention. And while I believe with all my heart that education is primarily a state issue, and it ought to be administered at the state level, not the federal, there needs to be a discussion at the national level, not the federal level from the government, but a national discussion of what makes for an education system that actually focuses on the students and not merely the perpetuation of the institution of the school. We've got to decide if we are school people or if we're kid people. If our focus is upon the school or is it upon the children within that school? 1 in 3 kids in America drops out of school today. Let me suggest to you, they are not dropping out because they are dumb. They are dropping out because they are bored. They are bored because we have created a curriculum and fixed it and hope that the kids somehow will find themselves comfortable within that already established curriculum. What we are not doing is to understanding that every child is different and that we need to be building the curriculum around the child rather than try to build the child around the curriculum. Let me give an example of specifically what I mean. There are three basic things that create educational reform. One is to have clear standards, one is to measure against those standards, and the third is to have accountability as to whether or not we're meeting the standards and consequences when we don't. It's not that difficult. During 10.5 years as a governor, one of the areas I focused most of my attention was in the area of improving education in my state, and I'll let the record speak for itself. But we found that you do not improve education by lowering standards so more kids can make the false presumption that they're doing well. You raise the standard in order to increase their capacity of performance. It's not different than it would be in basketball. If a team was losing every game, you don't improve the team's performance by going out at that particular gym and lowering the goal from 10 feet from the rim to the floor to 6 so that every child in his own gym can dunk the ball. Because he's not going to play at a 6-foot goal every time he leaves his own gym. He's going to be playing with the rim that's 10 feet from the floor, and he'd better learn how to hit it there rather than lower the goal so he can give himself the false impression that he's doing it. The idea of inflating grades in order to give kids a false sense of self-esteem is one of the most harmful, destructive things we've done in this country. You do not improve education by lowering standards, rather by raising them and insisting that we meet those standards as opposed to assuming that kids cannot meet them. Secondly, you measure. Why do we keep score at football, basketball, and baseball games? Because the outcome matters. The geniuses who think that we would be better off if we'd never hurt Johnny's feelings by telling him that he failed need to understand that the reason that we keep score, and couldn't you imagine how disappointing it would be to 70,000 fans in the stadium if sometime the announcer came on and said, we've decided to turn the scoreboard off, we're not keeping score, we just want the guys down there to have a good time tonight. Would that be acceptable to anybody in the Super Bowl? I don't think so. And it should never be acceptable to any parent in this country to be paying the kind of money they're paying in taxes to cover the cost of education and then not to be absolutely adamant that we know how well our students are doing. Measuring and accountability. When we fail, fix it and deal with those who are responsible. Pay good teachers more for doing a good job. And the ones who don't, they need to find something else to do. And then we need to recognize that, as I spoke about the curriculum, that one of the most unfortunate mistakes of the past generation is that we have deconstructed the music and arts programs out of our schools, much to the detriment of our children's education. And I want to express why this is important. When I've said this, a lot of times people say, I didn't know Republicans felt this way. And I always respond, Republicans like kids too. And we believe in excellence. And the reality is that some kids are left brain dominant, which means that they think logically. They're going to do well, somewhat automatically, in subjects like math and language. But there are other kids who are right brain dominant. They have a creative personality. And if our education system does not touch their talent, they will be a major part of that group of 30% of the kids in this country who will drop out of school, never complete their education. Among minorities, it's 50%. That ought to scare the daylights out of us. And these are people who will not be taxpayers, they will be tax takers for their entire lives. And they are not in that position altogether because they are incapable. It's often because we never had anything that interested them and that touched where they were and that believed that they could do something more than sit in a classroom. And we really destroy them when we tell them, come in, sit down, be quiet, pay attention. Music and art programs are vital. In fact, we know that if a child studies music, that child will do better in math, language, and will do better in science because he learns the basic rudiments of education, which is you learn how to learn. I'm passionate about this because I've seen what happens over a period of time when we think we're saving money by getting rid of a part of the curriculum that is necessary for the total education of every child. And somehow we congratulate ourselves for cutting the budget without understanding that what we've really done is cut our own legs out from under us, because the future economy is going to be built on creativity, not just intelligence. Having intelligence without knowing what to do with it is worthless. It's the equivalent of having knowledge without wisdom. And wisdom comes from not only knowing something, but knowing what to do with it. And I would suggest that touching the creativity of every child is a function that not only makes good sense, but from a spiritual standpoint, it's fundamental. If we believe there is a creator, we must believe that he's creative. And if we believe that he's creative and he's created us in his image, we must believe that he has created us to be creative as well. Stifle the creativity and you're stifling something that is innate to the human soul. So our education system needs to be awakening that which in each student will make that student want to learn and spend the rest of his or her life learning. We're entering into this discussion of health care. We're entering into the discussion of health care in this country, and what I fear is that we're radically moving toward a system in which the government will tell you whether or not you'll be able to see the doctor, when and for what level of health care. By the way, when someone says that health care is a right, ask them to define what do they mean by health care. Now, we would all agree that if you're hit by a car in the middle of a street, you should be taken to the emergency room and treated, and that happens every day in this country, whether you have an insurance card or not. The question is, define what health care means. Is it cosmetic surgery? Is it a hip replacement, knee replacement? And at what point? Who makes the decision? Do you want a government bureaucrat making the decision when that decision will be based totally on the amount of money that's in the budget and whether or not the government can afford for you to have that procedure? Maybe you have more confidence in the government than I do, but the last person I want making that decision for me is a nameless, faceless bureaucrat in some office thousands of miles from where I live, deciding what I should or should not have. It is rationing that is inevitable when we have a single-payer system, and the biggest problem I have with the direction in which we seem to be going is that we're not addressing the fundamental issue as to why the healthcare system in this country is in trouble. And the fact is, what drives almost 80% of the cost of the $2.4 trillion that we spend in healthcare is chronic disease. My dear friends, we do not have a healthcare crisis in America. What we have is a health crisis in America. When 80% of all the expenditures are spent on diseases that we could prevent or cure with lifestyle changes, the fact is, America is best described like an NFL football game on a Sunday afternoon, where you have 22 people down on the field in desperate need of rest, and there are 60,000 people in the stands in desperate need of exercise. That is, in essence, a picture of America today. Our healthcare costs are driven primarily by three behaviors: overeating, underexercising, and smoking. I'm not suggesting that the government should tell us what to eat or what not to eat, or force us to exercise, or to dictate every habit we have. But I do believe that if we have incentive programs that encourage people to make better decisions, money is far better spent on the prevention side than the intervention side, because the truth is, prevention is a lot less expensive than intervention at the crisis catastrophic stage. Our current system is broken because it is fundamentally upside down. The entire system, from the way we train the doctors, to reimburse the doctors, to insure the patients, to even decide what the procedures are and the research tools, are built on the idea that we wait until people are catastrophically ill and we try to figure out what we can do to intervene. And the result of that is an unbelievably expensive healthcare system that now takes about 17% of our gross domestic product, more than any nation on earth. The next near nation to that is 10.5%. And by the way, if you want to know the difference between, if we were at 11%, that would still make us higher than anyone else on the planet, but less than the 17%. The amount of money that represents is between $700 and $800 billion every single year. Just enough for Obama to have another stimulus package, most likely, but here's another figure. 85% of all health care costs in the life of an American individual are spent in the last 18 months of life. I'm going to repeat that because a lot of you went, ooh. So I want to make sure you heard correctly. 85% of the lifetime health care expenditures in an American's life are spent in his or her last 18 months of life. Sometimes, and largely that's driven because we, due to chronic disease, do not run to the finish line or even walk to the finish line. We limp to the finish line. We're very ill by the time we get there. And the cost of the end-of-life care is unbelievable compared to prenatal care, neonatal care, childhood care, adolescent care, care for young adults. If the focus were on prevention and not just intervention, there's more than enough money in the overall health care expenditures of America. But if we put it in the hands of government, just remember, the government is not interested in empowering the individual to be independent of government. The government becomes more interested in somehow enslaving the individuals to the government, so the government will be more important and more necessary in every decision they make. One fundamental difference between the classic idea of the conservative thought and what may be called liberal or progressive, whichever you choose, is that as conservatives, we fundamentally believe that the greatest purpose the government has is to be as small as it can be, as limited it can be, and as local as it can be, so that it empowers people to be their best rather than making decisions for individuals. This is what is the heart of the view of conservatism. I believe this, that we have a tax structure that penalizes the very thing that we ought to be rewarding and rewards the thing we ought to be penalizing. Now, many of you know that one of the positions that I took very strongly during the course of the campaign and continue to be an advocate for is a total overhaul of our tax structure and system. And it's not just a tinkering or a tweaking of it. Our current tax code, 67,000 pages long. Nobody understands it, most especially the Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, who didn't understand it well enough to pay all of his taxes. Always amazed when a person runs an agency who oversees an enterprise in which he has been unsuccessful in being able to complete the basic, fundamental, rudimentary principles of the agency, filling out a 1040 form. I'll never be appointed to an Obama cabinet because I've paid all my taxes and done it on time. I understand now I have no chance. I'm an advocate for what's called a fair tax, and let me explain for those of you that are not familiar. It's a tax that would only be assessed at the point of consumption, not at the point of productivity. And here's why I believe that it makes sense. By the way, I wish I had designed it and come up with it. But it was created by some of the smartest economists in the country from Stanford and Boston University and Harvard and MIT. They were given the task of coming up with an economic system of taxation that would be the best way for us to get the money that the government needs to fundamentally operate, and to do so in a way that does not upend productivity. Now, quite frankly, those who commissioned the study, who put almost $20 million into it, expected that what would come forth from the study was the proposal of a flat tax, which, by the way, would be a much appreciated improvement over the current system. But what they came back with was, in fact, a flat tax, but not flat on the point of income, but flat on the point of consumption. And here's how it would work. All taxes on productivity would be eliminated. There would be no income tax, corporate or individual. There would be no tax on inheritance, no tax on dividends, no tax on savings. There would be zero tax on inheritance. And the idea is that what you reward, you get more of, and what you penalize, you get less of. You know, I intuitively knew this by being a parent and having dogs. By the way, those are two separate tasks at my house. Let me clarify. My wife and I raised 3 children. They're all grown now. I always say the 2 greatest days in a parent's life, the day that the child is born and the day that the child gets out of college and off your payroll and on somebody else's. But our kids are grown, and so they're raised, and that's a good thing. But we learned something raising 3 kids, that if you reward behavior, you get more of it. And if you consequence behavior, you tend to start getting less of it. Now, when the kids all left, we, I guess, just somehow just did it, but we ended up with 3 dogs. The kids think we replaced them with dogs. They also think we treat the dogs better than we treated them. We remind them that the dogs have been easier to deal with than they ever were, too. But the other thing I've learned about training dogs, dogs give us the same kind of behavior. When you reward behavior, you get more of it. When you consequence behavior, you get less of it. Now, what is it that we do in a current economic system under our current tax code, 67,000 pages that nobody understands and very few people read? I'll tell you what we get. We penalize productivity. The harder one works, the more taxes one pays. And I'm not just talking about in terms of the basic cost, but because it's a progressive tax, the rates actually start going up with the level of productivity. That's counterintuitive to an economic system that says if you want people to make money, invest money, risk that money, create jobs with that money, you should reward what they are doing because that's foundational to the economic success of the nation. And if you want to hurt the nation, then you just keep punishing those people who are actually creating the jobs. Now, for those who think that this is only a prescription for the wealthy, let me assure you that no one would benefit more than it would be beneficial to the people at the bottom of the economic spectrum, because the current system says if you're at the bottom, we want to keep you there. When I was in New Hampshire campaigning, I was visiting a machine shop, talking to a guy with a high school education working in the machine shop. After I'd visited with some of the people there and answering some questions, he pulled me aside. He said, "I want to ask you something." And he told me his story. Here it was. He said, "I'm working in the machine shop and I'm taking on a second shift. I'm now working 16 hours, not 8, because my daughter is going to grad school at Cornell University. I want her to live a better life than me. I want her to get a better education than me. I want her to make more money than me and do better." But he said, "Governor, I don't understand something. I started working the second shift so I could help my daughter because her education at Cornell and the graduate school is $52,000 a year. First thing I thought was, thank you, Lord, that my daughter doesn't want to go to Cornell grad school." But then he told me, he said, "You know what happened? I started working the second shift and I realized that because I was working the second shift, it put me in a new income bracket and my taxes went up. And I'm not making twice as much. I'm barely making more than I was before when I was only working one shift." He said, "Can you tell me that that's fair?" I said, "Of course I can't, because it isn't." Here's a man who's trying to help his daughter get an education. He's being penalized for working twice as hard. You know what's really ironic? If he really wants the federal government to assist him, don't work 2 shifts. In fact, quit the other one. Then she'll qualify for all kinds of assistance and grants. Now, can anybody here look me in the eye and tell me that makes sense? And we wonder what we need to do to fix our economy. Well, it isn't bailing out private businesses who have been recklessly mismanaged at the expense of those who have been carefully managed. And I'm one of those people who opposed the TARP bills last year and thought they were a very foolish way for us to go and would only lead to unprecedented government involvement, and turns out that's exactly what's happened. And so a TARP bill and the stimulus bill and a massive, unbelievably, extraordinarily high budget has led to a deficit 4 times what all the presidents before Barack Obama had ever indebted this country to in the space of 6 months. That is not how we build a strong economy. We ought to reward work instead of consequencing it. We ought to reward the risk and the entrepreneurial activity that builds a strong economy. And we should recognize that every American has a right to be able to work hard and personally make more of the decisions as to what happens with those assets, as opposed to the government taking an increasing role in how those assets are going to be distributed. If I reach into my pocket and I give something to somebody, that's generosity and charity. If I reach into your pocket and take something and give it to somebody, we used to call that theft. Now we just call it government. I think theft is still a better word. And let me say that our country is at its strongest when it understands that we're not to be a country that bullies others, but we're never to be a country that backs down in the face of tyranny. The reason that so many Americans, Democrat and Republican alike, came to love, respect, and revere President Ronald Reagan was because he went into office with a clear set of principles as it related to the idea that America is a great nation because it's a strong nation, and the day that it wasn't a strong nation, it would cease to be a great nation. That was a position from which he never retreated, nor did he ever apologize for it to anyone, anytime, under any circumstances. And it also was the reason that, as I believe we all know and history has recorded, that the greatest threat to our freedom for such a long part of my generation was eliminated with the destruction of what had been an evil system that he had the guts to call an evil empire. And it disappeared as the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe fell and the Berlin Wall came down. And I'm grateful that he did not listen to those who would have suggested that he somehow scaled back his convictions, or that he somehow believed that we would be a better nation and a stronger nation if we just became one among many and more like the rest of them. He believed that the power and the strength that America had was a God-given power to be used carefully, wisely, but unapologetically to stand for freedom wherever freedom sought to breathe. And for that, this world is a better place. And I pray we will once again come to that position of believing it. Let me conclude I'm standing over here means it's time for the questions. I might not be the smartest guy that ever held office. I know what that means. But I want to conclude tonight with this point that I hope you'll hear carefully before we take the questions. And here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a sense of pessimism among many people, and there's this thought that our greatest days are behind us and the future's not very bright. I just refuse to accept that and to share that pessimism. In fact, I want to be very clear with you tonight. I believe that America is a resilient nation, and we've seen that over and over again. We should never have existed. Those farmers grabbing muskets off the wall, better suited for hunting rabbits than fighting a war, won it anyway. We've been through a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, all kinds of internal conflicts, and somehow we've been resilient enough to come through it and find our legs again and be strong again. And for all the pessimists who believe that our best days were back there and our worst days are out there, let's just remind ourselves that America is not just about the people who hold office temporarily. It's about the interminable spirit of the American people who've always been able to make course corrections when we've made mistakes and been able to recapture that understanding that freedom is God's greatest gift to us and that He's given it to us for us to be good stewards, to preserve it and to pass it on to the next generation. I'm not going to be one of those who's ready to wring my hands and to say, you know, it's all over. I think it's time to roll up our sleeves and decide that the best is yet to come. And I hope that that will be your spirit as an American. It was certainly the spirit of the president whose name adorns this building, who took office when America probably was at its lowest ebb in terms of its own self-confidence, with 20% interest rates, fuel that we couldn't afford, lines around the block to get gasoline, and the humiliation of having a nation hold many of our fellow Americans hostage for a year, and a tax structure that was choking business, and a world that looked like it was an awfully unsafe place in which to be. And 8 years later, when the distinguished gentleman, Ronald Reagan, left the White House and came back here, not just this country, but this world was a better and a safer place in which to live. He was not a great president because he was afraid of his principles. He was a great president because he had principles and he never wavered from governing with them. That is the future of America. Thank you and God bless you. Thank you. I'll let you answer.
You can
okay.
Stay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Very Reagan-esque. We appreciate that. We have time for a couple of questions. Let's start at the top this time. The young man up there.
Hi, Governor. I was the one who drew the picture and gave it to you, so I wanted to thank you for being such a strong supporter of the arts. My question is, I'm 21 years old. I'm a Hispanic as well. What do you think the Republicans need to do in order to reach minorities, including Hispanics? What do they have to do in order to corral them into the conservative movement and the Republican movement as well?
You know, I don't think you tailor the message for different demographic groups like some would suggest. I believe that every person who comes to this country comes because they realize this is a place where people flee to, not a place they flee from. We certainly should have the kind of borders that are secure, and that when people come here, they come legally, so that we invite them through the front door and no one breaks in through the window. That's not just for the sake of those of us who are here, it's for the sake of those who come. But it's also important that we recognize that whether a person is Hispanic or African American, the basic yearning of the human heart is the same, and that is to be able to know that what we do in this life will matter, that we will have a safe neighborhood, decent schools for our kids, a job that will produce for us the capacity to be independent and free from somebody telling us what to do. The reason that I ended up getting 48% of the African-American vote in my state as a governor, people say, that's unusual for a Republican. I said, you know, it's not that unusual when you realize that African-American families want the same thing everybody else does. I believe it's the same true of Hispanic families. The mistake is that when we wait till October of an election year and try to reach into a community and suddenly act like we're interested in when we haven't done it long term, and we have not translated the impact of the message of what true conservatism is, then we get into trouble. And I don't for 1 minute think that Republicans ought to assume that the votes of anyone are unreachable or untouchable for us. Quite the opposite. In fact, let me be specific about the Hispanic community. Strong, strong commitment to family, strong commitment to life. This is why Republicans should not feel somehow intimidated by their long-standing positions on those issues, because those are issues that win, they don't lose among the Hispanic community.
Governor, my name is Michael Lipaz, and I like your show very much.
Thank you.
I like also your private flight attendant that you introduced to us the last show. You articulated so well.
For those who didn't see the show, they're wondering what in the world you're talking about. We had just so you'll know very quickly, we had a young man from Southwest Airlines who raps the safety announcement. And he does it in a very entertaining way, and he was on the show, and he really was wonderful. He's going to be back next week, so there you go.
Governor, you articulated so well all these principles that you believe in, and we all believe in it, and it makes so much sense. And many times I'm asking myself and ask other people the question, how come the left doesn't understand these principles? And they're also fervent in their belief and what they want to do with all the stimulus and throwing us down into the trash. But how can it be? What part of the brain do they use?
Okay, let me be fair. I'm one of those people who, I don't believe Democrats are wrong all the time. I don't believe Republicans are right all the time. I think Democrats are wrong most of the time, but not all the time. In all fairness, one of the things that I believe that we need to recognize is sometimes people will approach an issue, and I think for many of those on the left really have, if you sit down and have a conversation with people with deep convictions, it's not that they want a different outcome. They think that it will be achieved a different way. And in fairness to many people who I have had great conversations with on the left, I have great admiration and respect for their genuine interest in the well-being of people. I believe that's sincere. I believe that they want kids to have a decent education, and they want them to be healthy, and they want them to have safe neighborhoods. They tend to believe in many cases that it will require an extraordinary effort on the part of the greater sense of the government. The basic difference is this, and this is an oversimplification, so I want to tell you that on the front end. But the way that the left and the right tend to approach things is that we believe on the right, the Republicans, the conservatives, however you want to list us, that the greatest power is the power of the individual, and that the hope is that each individual would be strong enough within himself or herself to learn how to be independent. There is a view that if, as individuals, our strength comes from that uniqueness that is ours individually. Many people on the left believe that we are a part of a group, and that only as our group succeeds can the individuals within that group succeed. I want you to understand this is a legitimate position for people to take, and therefore you'll hear people on the left say we have to elevate women, we have to elevate minorities, we have to elevate union members, workers, but they will speak in terms of how the group functions, and if the group does well, the individuals within the group do well. We tend to believe as conservatives that every person is an individual, and that I'm able to rise above whatever group that I may be connected to. I became a conservative as a teenager out of a Democratic household in a county where there were no native Republicans. I mean, none. There were 7 Republicans in Hempstead County in Hope, Arkansas, and every one of them had moved in from somewhere. None of them were native there. I used to say that I grew up in the Deep South where the greatest 3 heroes were Elvis, Jesus, and FDR, not necessarily in that order. So understand that. How did I end up being a Republican? It was because as a kid, looking at my own situation, my dad was a fireman, worked a job as a mechanic, 2 jobs, barely paid the rent on the little rent house we lived in. And I realized that what he had really taught me, though he didn't understand that he was teaching me conservative political ideology, was that no matter where I came from, I didn't have to stay there. That if I would work hard, get a good education, treat people fairly, be honest and decent with other people, and do more than the people around me, that there was no limit where I could go. And never to accept that because of where I lived, I couldn't live anywhere else. Never to accept because what he did, I couldn't do any better than that. And because he instilled that into me, I ultimately decided, you know, I'm not tied to any group. I'm not tied to the limitations of my family. I'm the first male in my entire family lineage that graduated high school, much less went on to college. Now, I'm just saying that what happened to me was I recognized that the strength of America is that it gave a kid like me the belief, the hope, and the confidence that where I started was not where I had to stop. If I believed that it was necessary for my group to succeed before I could succeed, I'd still be in Hope, Arkansas. I might would have gotten through high school, but never would have gone on to college. And I certainly wouldn't be standing here tonight. That's why I believe like I believe.
We have time for one quick final question, please.
If you were President of the United States at the present time, how would you handle Iran? You can avoid answering this one.
And the smart thing would be
60 seconds.
60 seconds. Well, that's surely. Well, if I'm going to do, if I got 60 seconds, might as well take on North Korea and Eastern Europe, and let's handle Honduras and Venezuela while we're at it. The basic premise of dealing with Iran is to recognize the Iranian people are not our enemy, even if we think the Iranian government may be. I want to remind everybody here something, that on the night of September 11th, when there was dancing in the streets in Arab capitals all over the world, of the Twin Towers having fallen and 3,000 fellow Americans being murdered, in Tehran, they were lighting candles. Please don't forget that. The Iranian people are not people who hate the United States. Many of them yearn for the freedom. We've seen it now in the streets in the fact that Neda Sultan, who lost her life by the bullet of her own government. What we need to be doing with Iran is never believing that we're going to find some common ground with a government that is essentially insane. Any government that believes the Holocaust did not exist is not a credible government. We must believe that the way to deal with Iran is to deal with its people and encourage them and try to bolster their confidence in believing that they should not give up in their quest for freedom, and make our relationships and our identity with them instead of trying to make it with Ahmadinejad or our Khamenei, because we're never going to sit down and have tea with them and have a successful outcome. So that would be the overall overarching principle. And I think I'm getting the look. We're finished here. God bless you, and thank you very, very much. Thank you.
After I
Thank you, Governor. A couple of housekeeping. I ask that you please remain standing or in the room until Mrs. Reagan and the official party departs. We want to thank everybody again. And my final comment is, there's less than 30 months to the Iowa caucuses. Good night.